The storm didn't arrive like weather. It arrived like a decision. Seattle's waterfront had been holding its breath all evening. Wind worrying the glass, rain tracing long, impatient lines down the skyline. Until at exactly the moment Imani Brooks stepped out of her rideshare, the city flickered. One heartbeat of light, then darkness. The private memorial hall rose ahead of her like a low, modern cathedral. Steel and cedar and glass pressed tight against the water. Its clean architecture meant to look humble, while still costing more than most people's houses. For a second, it seemed to vanish into the storm. Then emergency strips blinked on in thin, red lines, turning the entrance into a warning. Imani adjusted her coat, the black wool still damp from the walk across the parking lot. She wasn't dressed to impress. She was dressed to endure. In the ER, you learn quickly, attention was a drug, quiet was a discipline, and grief was a language people only spoke fluently when it benefited them. A generator hummed somewhere deep inside the building, but the sound didn't bring comfort. It sounded like a machine trying not to fail in public. Two security guards stood under the awning, their posture rigid in the half-light. Behind them, through the glass, silhouettes moved, too smooth, too practiced. The kind of people who knew where to stand so the camera caught their good side, even at a memorial. Imani's invitation felt heavier than paper in her palm. It didn't have a name printed in large, proud letters. Just a simple line, Whitaker Memorial, private attendance. And beneath it, an address she'd almost deleted from her phone because it made the past feel too close. She took a breath and walked up. The guard on the left stopped her with one hand, palm outward, like she was traffic. List, he said. Imani handed over the invitation without flinching. The guard scanned it, then glanced at her face, slowly, like he was deciding whether her features belonged in this building. His radio crackled. A voice answered, tight and irritated. The guard's expression changed, not to anger, but to something worse. Permission. Side entrance, he said, nodding toward a narrow corridor that wrapped around the building. Main doors are restricted. Restricted. At a memorial. Imani didn't argue. She'd learned long ago that if someone wanted you to feel small, they'd offer you a door that made you look like you were sneaking in. She followed the corridor, rain cutting sideways, her heels clicking against wet stone. To her right, the water heaved and slapped the seawall like it was impatient with the entire performance of wealth and mourning. Ahead, a single door waited beneath a dim security light. No flowers, no welcome, just a metal handle and a keypad. A door that shouldn't have existed for guests. Imani paused, listening. Through the wall, she could hear laughter, soft, contained, the kind people use when they didn't want to look heartless. She could also hear something else, a low murmur of confusion, like a room realizing the power had gone out and panicking because the lighting wasn't flattering. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A message from Nia. You good? Don't let them shrink you. Imani stared at the words until the storm blurred them into watercolor. Then she slipped the phone away, centered herself, and placed her hand on the cold handle. The door didn't open. Of course it didn't. A keypad beeped once, then flashed red. An elegant way of saying no. Imani's throat tightened, not with fear, but with a familiar insult. The kind that didn't need words. The kind that said, you are not expected. You are not wanted. You are not supposed to be here. Behind her, the corridor filled with the sound of rolling wheels. Uneven, stubborn, followed by a breathless cough. Imani turned. A man sat in a wheelchair beneath the rain, his coat soaked through, his hands trembling as he tried to guide himself over a shallow ridge in the pavement. He was older, 70s maybe, face creased from time and something sharper than time. Not the softened kind of age that comes from being cared for. His eyes met hers. Not pleading, not embarrassed, just watching, as if he'd been waiting to see what kind of person would look back. Imani didn't hesitate. She stepped toward him, crouched low so her body became a shield against the wind, and checked the wheel lock with the same instinct she used when a patient's IV line kinked at the worst moment. "You're stuck," she said gently. He let out a humorless breath. "Seems I am." Imani braced her palm against the wheel and guided it over the ridge. The chair jolted, then steadied. Rain ran down her wrist and into the cuff of her coat. She didn't care. "Try now," she said. The man tested it, smooth this time. He looked at her as though he were memorizing a detail he'd need later. "Thank you," he said, quieter. Then she glanced back at the door, the keypad still glowing red, like a private verdict. A door that refused her, a room that didn't know she existed, and a night that had already begun choosing sides. If you're still with Imani in this moment, standing in the rain, holding her composure like a candle in a storm, go ahead and tap like, drop a comment telling me what you think is really behind that locked door, and follow the channel. Because from here on out, the darkness isn't just the weather, it's the warning. The rain had a way of erasing borders. It blurred the edge between the memorial hall and the ocean, between polished wealth and the brute honesty of weather. It turned the corridor into a narrow, shining throat of stone, and it turned Imani's coat into something heavier than fabric, something that clung like responsibility. The man in the wheelchair adjusted his grip on the rims. His knuckles were pale, his hands steady in the way of someone who had learned not to ask for help. There were bruised shadows under his eyes, and a small cut at the corner of his mouth that looked less like an accident and more like the aftermath of pride. Imani could have pointed him toward the main entrance and walked away. She could have returned to the keypad and kept trying codes that were never meant to work. Instead, she stepped behind him. "May I?" she asked, soft but not uncertain. He didn't answer right away. His gaze slid past her, toward the locked side door, as if he already understood the kind of night this was. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. Imani placed her hands on the chair's handles and felt how the metal trembled under the storm. The wheels caught in a shallow crack. She lifted slightly, not with force but with knowledge, like lifting a patient's shoulder to ease pain without making it worse. "Someone should have fixed this," she muttered, more to the world than to him. "Someone always should have," he replied. His voice held a rasp of age, but also something sharper, an intelligence that didn't announce itself. Imani recognized it the way you recognize a heartbeat on a monitor, not by sound alone, but by rhythm. She guided him forward along the corridor. The security light above them flickered again, and for a moment the man's face appeared in clear slices. Stern jaw, high cheekbones, a scar at the temple half hidden by wet hair. Not fragile, not helpless, just inconvenient to ignore. Inside the wall, laughter rose and fell. Glass clinked. A host's voice floated through the building, too calm for a blackout, too practiced for real grief. Imani's stomach tightened. Not because she was afraid, because she understood what this was. When lights went out in the ER, everything became simple. You triaged, you moved with purpose, you protected what mattered. But in rooms like this, darkness didn't simplify anything. It gave people permission. Permission to decide who counted. Permission to pretend they didn't see. They reached the side door, and Imani stopped to wipe rain from her lashes. The keypad glowed like a tiny, stubborn eye. The man in the chair watched her, still assessing. "You're not on their list either?" he asked. Imani almost smiled. "Almost. I guess not," she said. "But I have an invitation." He gave a short, dry sound that could have been a laugh if it had warmth in it. "Invitations are paper. Lists are power." Imani held his gaze. Power shouldn't need a storm to prove itself. Something moved in his expression, so fast it might have been the reflection of lightning. Approval, maybe, or recognition. She tried the handle again. Locked. A soft click behind them. Footsteps, quick, purposeful. One of the guards had followed, drawn by the delay, by the fact that someone was making the corridor feel like a scene. The guard's flashlight cut through the rain and landed on the wheelchair first, then rose to Imani's face. "What's going on?" the guard barked. Imani lifted her chin. "He needs access. and this door's locked. The guard's eyes narrowed, the beam lingering too long on Imani, as if her presence was the real inconvenience. Then he said, "This entrance isn't for what?" Imani asked quietly. "For people who get wet?" The guard's jaw tightened. He looked at the older man, and something flickered in his posture. Hesitation. Not compassion. Recognition. The older man did not speak. He simply met the guard's stare with the calm authority of someone who didn't have to raise his voice. The guard swallowed, stepped forward, and entered a code. Beep, beep, green. The door unlocked with a soft sigh, like the building resented having to comply. Imani didn't miss the guard's sudden politeness as he held it open. "Sir," he said to the man in the wheelchair, voice strained. "Sir." Imani's eyes narrowed. The man had been invisible in the rain, yet the moment a code was entered, he became a title. Inside, the air was warmer, scented with cedar and expensive candles. Emergency lights painted the hall in muted reds and ambers, turning everyone's faces into masks. Smiles too bright, condolences too rehearsed. People turned as they entered, first to the wheelchair, then to Imani. A ripple of whispers traveled faster than footsteps. A woman in pearls covered her mouth as if scandal was contagious. A man with a silver watch leaned toward another and murmured with the comfort of someone who had never been told no. Imani kept her hands on the chair, guiding it forward with quiet control. She refused to hurry, refused to shrink. The man in the wheelchair leaned slightly toward her, voice low enough that only she could hear. "You didn't have to do that," he said. Imani's eyes stayed forward. "Yes, I did." "Why?" "Because it was right," she could have said. Because ignoring someone is a kind of violence. Because she'd spent her life patching up the aftermath of other people's cruelty. But the truth that rose in her chest was simpler and sharper. "Because I know what it feels like," she said softly, "to stand outside a door that everyone else thinks you don't deserve to open." The man's gaze stayed on her profile, not pitying, not praising, measuring something deeper. As they moved into the center of the hall, Imani's eyes found the main doors, grand, tall, guarded, the doors she'd been diverted from. And near them, like a queen beside her throne, stood Cassandra Whitaker. Even in the emergency lighting, Cassandra looked untouched by darkness. Her hair was perfect. Her dress held its structure. Her grief, if it existed, had been edited. Cassandra's eyes landed on the wheelchair, then slid to Imani. And in that single glance, Imani felt the air change. Subtle, but absolute, like a room deciding what it would allow. Cassandra's lips curved in something that wasn't a smile, a recognition, a warning. Imani's hands tightened on the chair's handles, because suddenly she understood. The stranger in the rain wasn't just a man who needed help. He was a match, and she had just lit it. The memorial hall was built to look honest. Glass walls facing the water, cedar beams, a ceiling so high it made every whisper feel important. Even in the blackout, the place had its own kind of light. Emergency strips along the floor, candles arranged like intention, and the glow of phones lifted discreetly in hands that pretended not to record. Imani guided the wheelchair forward with the calm of a woman who had walked through worse storms than rain. In the ER, grief came without makeup. It arrived loud, shaking, messy. Here, grief wore tailored suits and perfume. Here, people mourned like they were being judged. She felt their eyes before she heard their words. A ripple traveled through the room, polite interest disguised as sympathy, and something sharper underneath, the reflex to categorize. Who is she? Why is she here? In spaces like this, curiosity was never innocent. It was inventory. The man in the chair did not shrink from the attention. He moved like someone used to being observed, like someone who had survived rooms where decisions were made with a smile. His hands rested neatly in his lap, his spine straight, his face unreadable. Imani's fingers loosened slightly on the handles when they reached a clear patch of floor near the front. That was when Cassandra Whitaker began to walk. It wasn't a stride. It was a procession. Cassandra glided across the hall as if the blackout had been planned for her entrance. Her pearls, small, precise, expensive, glowed caught every flicker of candlelight, and threw it back like tiny verdicts. Her dress was black, but not morning black. It was the kind of black that made people think of luxury, not loss. She stopped close enough that Imani could smell her perfume. White flowers and something metallic underneath, like money. Cassandra's gaze moved over Imani slowly, the way a person looks at a stain and decides whether to pretend it isn't there. Then she looked at the wheelchair. "Mr. Reardon," she said, voice warm enough for the room to hear, but thin enough for Imani to feel. How unexpected. The man in the chair did not correct her. He did not greet her. He simply lifted his eyes and held hers with the mild patience of someone watching an actor forget their lines. Cassandra's smile tightened. "And you are?" She turned to Imani, still smiling, but the question wasn't a question. It was a command. Imani met her gaze. "Imani Brooks." Cassandra repeated it like she was tasting something unfamiliar. "Imani," a pause. "And what is your role here, Imani Brooks?" Role. Not relationship, not connection, not grief. Role. Imani's jaw set, but her voice stayed even. "I received an invitation." Cassandra's eyes flicked to Imani's hands, still damp from rain, then to her shoes, practical, simple, then back to her face. The scan was quick, but it left a mark, the way a sharp object leaves a scratch even after it's gone. "An invitation," Cassandra echoed, lifting her brows in amusement. "This is a private memorial." "So the invitation implied," Imani said gently. A few people nearby turned their heads, drawn by the tone. Not outrage, interest. They loved a confrontation as long as it didn't touch them. Cassandra leaned in slightly, lowering her voice just enough to make the room listen harder. "Let me make this easy," she said. "This isn't a place for community outreach. Gabe supported many causes. We all admire that." She gestured vaguely, as if Imani were a category of charity. "But tonight is for family, for the people who actually mattered to him." The words landed like a slap delivered with gloves on, soft, elegant, and intended to bruise. Imani felt heat rise in her chest. Not because Cassandra was cruel, Imani had met cruel people before, but because Cassandra was confident the cruelty would be tolerated. And the room proved her right. No one stepped forward. No one objected. They shifted their weight, sipped their drinks, pretended to read the memorial program. Silence in expensive rooms was always dressed as decorum. But Imani knew what it really was. Consent. Imani looked at Cassandra's pearls. How perfectly they sat at her throat like a collar. Then she spoke. "I didn't come for admiration," she said. "And I'm not here because I need something from him." Cassandra's smile didn't waver. "Then why are you here?" "Because you kept doors locked," Imani thought. "Because you don't want the past to walk in with wet sleeves and a steady spine." But she said only what was true and safe to say. "Because he mattered to me," Imani answered. Cassandra's eyes sharpened. "Did he?" The question was quiet, casual, almost kind, but it was designed to make Imani doubt herself in front of strangers. Cassandra lifted her hand, 2 fingers, and a security guard stepped closer like a trained animal. "Escort her out," Cassandra said, still smiling. "We don't want distractions tonight." The guard hesitated, looking to Mr. Reardon, then back to Cassandra. His gaze flicked to Imani again, measuring. He saw a woman who didn't belong to their world, and he saw the risk of offending the woman who paid for the world's softness. Imani's pulse stayed steady. Discipline. You didn't panic because someone else decided to become loud. She leaned slightly toward the wheelchair, her voice low. "Are you all right?" she asked the man, not the room. It was a small act of defiance, to care about the person people were using as a prop. Mr. Reardon's eyes lifted to hers. Something passed between them. Approval, perhaps, or warning. Then Cassandra's voice cut in, sweet as poison. "Imani," she said, and now the pearls felt like punctuation. "Don't confuse kindness with belonging." A murmur moved through the crowd, soft laughter from someone who wanted Cassandra's favor. a sympathetic inhale from someone who wanted to feel human without taking a risk. Imani turned back to Cassandra and held her gaze. "I'm not confused," Imani said calmly. "I'm just not afraid." Cassandra's smile finally cracked, just a hairline fracture. Then she spoke the word she'd been saving, the word meant to shrink Imani into something the room could dismiss. "You're nobody," Cassandra said softly, as if it were mercy. "And tonight, nobody doesn't get a seat." The guard reached for Imani's elbow. Imani didn't pull away violently. She didn't shout. She didn't give them the spectacle they wanted. She simply stepped back one pace and looked at the crowd, at the polished faces, the careful grief, the silence that watched cruelty happen as if it were a normal part of the evening. Then she lifted her eyes to Cassandra again. And in that moment, under emergency lights and candle flame, Imani realized something that steadied her more than anger ever could. If Cassandra needed to call her nobody so badly, it meant Cassandra already knew Imani was someone. And that knowledge, the fear underneath the pearls, was the first crack in Cassandra's control. The guard's fingers didn't tighten. They didn't have to. In rooms like this, force was rarely loud. It was practiced. It was polite. It was the pressure of expectation wrapped in a uniform and a smile. Imani felt the hand at her elbow like a stamp being placed on her skin, removed. Cassandra's pearls glimmered at her throat as if they were applauding themselves. Around them, the crowd held still, watching with the calm attention of people who believed consequences were for others. Imani did not plead. She had learned long ago that begging only feeds the kind of power that needs a witness. She took a slow breath and let her eyes travel, not to the exit, but to the room itself. She saw the small things people tried to hide: a board member's nervous swallow, a donor's sudden interest in their phone screen, a woman in black silk twisting her ring as if it could rewrite what she just allowed. And then she saw him. He was not in the front where the important people clustered. He wasn't hovering near Cassandra like the men who wanted to be useful. He stood a few steps back, near a column where the emergency light cut clean lines across his face. Enough illumination to reveal him, not enough to flatter. White American, early 30s, tall in an unshowy way, like height wasn't something he used as a weapon. His suit was dark, but it didn't look chosen for a camera. No silk pocket square, no memorial pin. His hair was damp at the edges, as if he'd come through the storm without worrying about what it would do to him. His gaze was fixed on Imani, not hungry, not pitying, not entertained. Just exact. The kind of gaze that counted details the way an ER monitor counts heartbeats. He stepped forward, not rushing, not dramatic, just enough movement to shift the air. "Excuse me," he said to the guard. The guard hesitated. "Sir?" The man's voice remained calm. "Before you escort her out, who authorized it?" A simple question, asked like a blade wrapped in velvet. The guard glanced toward Cassandra as if the answer was obvious. Cassandra's smile stayed in place, but her eyes sharpened, sensing interruption the way certain animals sense blood. "I did," Cassandra said smoothly. "This is a private event." The man nodded as if he accepted the sentence, then turned his attention back to Imani. He didn't say, "I'm sorry." He didn't say, "This is wrong." He said, "Do you want to leave?" Imani blinked once. The question wasn't an offer. It was a measurement. It placed the decision back in her hands, where Cassandra had tried to snatch it away. The room leaned in. People were suddenly invested, because now the scene had a new character and a new possibility: uncertainty. Imani's voice stayed soft. "I don't want to be dragged out." "That wasn't the question," he replied gently. His eyes held hers with an unsettling steadiness. There was no romance in it, no rescue, only clarity. "Do you want to leave?" he repeated. "Or do you want to stay long enough for the truth to have a chance to breathe?" Imani felt something shift inside her. Not hope, not pride, recognition. This man didn't believe in performances. He believed in pressure, in what people revealed when they were cornered. She looked at Cassandra, at the pearls, at the guard still hovering like a polite threat. Then she looked back at the stranger. "I came here," she said, "because a door was locked that shouldn't have been." The man's mouth tightened, barely. Approval, maybe, or interest. "What do you do?" he asked, still quiet, as if he were asking for a pulse rate. "I'm an ER nurse," Imani answered. His eyes flicked over her again, but differently now, not as a target, as a professional. "Then you understand triage," he said. "You understand what's urgent and what's just loud." A pause. "Tell me," he continued, "if you walk out of this room right now, what happens?" Imani didn't need long. She had lived long enough to know how stories were built in spaces like this. "They'll say I was a mistake," she said. "They'll make me a rumor, a disturbance, something that never belonged." "And if you stay?" he asked. Imani's throat tightened, but her eyes stayed steady. "Then they have to look at me." The man nodded once, as if that was the answer he'd been waiting for. Finally, he introduced himself. Not loudly, not with a hand extended to impress the room. "Ethan Hale," he said, "forensic auditor." Cassandra's expression flickered, a shadow crossing a candle flame. She knew that job. Everyone in her world knew what it meant when someone who followed money stepped into a room built on appearances. Ethan turned slightly toward Cassandra, but he did not challenge her directly. "Not yet. Instead, I won't defend you," he said quietly, "because you don't need defending." The words landed with a strange, clean weight, like a bandage applied without fuss, exactly where it was needed. "But I will ask you one more thing," Ethan continued, his voice low enough to feel intimate without being personal. Or will you walk through it like someone who has already decided she can't be?" Imani's heartbeat stayed calm, but the air around her sharpened with possibility. She lifted her chin. And for the first time that night, the room began to understand. The woman Cassandra called nobody had just been seen by the one man trained to notice everything. The room did not exhale. It only rearranged its silence, shifting it from certainty to caution, from smugness to calculation. Cassandra's command still hung in the air like perfume, sweet, expensive, difficult to escape. The guard's hand remained at Imani's elbow, not squeezing, just reminding her that power could touch you without leaving fingerprints. Ethan Hale didn't step between Imani and the guard like a hero in a movie. He stepped beside her, an angle, not a shield. And somehow, that was more unsettling, because it said, "I'm not here to save you. I'm here to see what you're made of." Imani looked at the wheelchair again, at the older man's wet coat, the tremor in his hands that might have been cold, or might have been performance. His gaze was too steady, too awake. When he blinked, it wasn't the slow blink of exhaustion. It was the measured blink of someone keeping time. Cassandra lifted her chin, pearls bright against her throat. "Ethan," she said pleasantly, as if using his name could put him back in a box. "This is neither the time nor the place." Ethan's eyes stayed on Cassandra for only a breath, enough to acknowledge her, not enough to grant her control. "Actually," he said quietly, "this is exactly the time." He turned toward the man in the wheelchair. "Mr. Reardon," Ethan added, voice slightly firmer now, "we should proceed." The title landed like a key turning in a lock. Mr. Reardon, a few heads snapped up. People who had been pretending not to watch suddenly remembered they were investors, donors, board allies. Names mattered here. Names were passports. Imani felt the smallest shift in the guard's posture, an invisible step backward. The older man did not smile. He simply adjusted the blanket over his knees and lifted his eyes to Cassandra with an expression so calm it could have been mercy. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, voice carrying now, "thank you for hosting." Cassandra's smile tightened at the corners. Of course, Mr. Reardon let the word hosting hang like a polite correction. Then he looked past her toward the room. "I apologize," he continued, "for the inconvenience of the blackout, but perhaps it's fitting." A murmur stirred, confused, curious. "In darkness," he said, "we learn who opens doors and who locks them." Imani felt a pulse of heat in her chest. Not anger this time, something closer to vindication, Quiet, steady, dangerous. Mr. Reardon reached into the inside pocket of his coat. The movement was small, but the room's attention followed it like a tide. People tense the way they do when someone pulls out a phone at the wrong moment, or a document at the right one. He produced a sealed envelope, thick and cream-colored, the kind that belonged to lawyers in last words. A red wax stamp held it closed. Simple, old-fashioned, impossible to ignore. Cassandra's eyes narrowed. "Richard, tonight," he said, cutting her off without raising his voice, "is not about speeches. The formal reading will be tomorrow morning at Whitaker Biotech headquarters, 9 a.m. sharp." The word formal struck the room like a bell. That wasn't memorial language. That was procedure. That was consequence. A board member cleared his throat. Someone in the back shifted their weight as if preparing to leave early. People always tried to outrun bad news. Mr. Reardon lifted the envelope slightly so everyone could see it. "This," he said, "is a directive from Dr. Gabriel Whitaker." Imani's throat tightened at the name. Gabe. The man who had once signed a scholarship with a pen that didn't tremble. The man whose absence had been explained to her in half-truths, in silences. The man she had mourned in private long before she had been allowed to mourn him in public. Cassandra stepped forward, her voice still smooth. "Dr. Whitaker's will is already filed. Anything additional should go through my counsel." Ethan's gaze sharpened. Mr. Reardon's did not. "It is going through counsel," Mr. Reardon said, the faintest edge entering his tone. "Through me." He paused, allowing the room to do what it always did when confronted with authority. Recalibrate. "I have served Dr. Whitaker for 26 years, Mr. Reardon continued. "I have watched him build this company from an idea into an institution. I have watched him make mistakes. I have watched him correct them." He glanced at Imani, just a glance, but it felt like a spotlight that didn't burn, only revealed. "And before he died," Mr. Reardon said, "he asked me to do one more thing." Cassandra's pearls seemed to shine harder, as if trying to blind the room to whatever came next. Mr. Reardon's voice lowered, enough to pull everyone closer. "He asked me to make sure that the people who claimed to love him could still recognize integrity when it walked in wet from the rain." A hush. Imani's breath caught. The words didn't feel like poetry. They felt like a message written with intention, sent across death like a bridge. Ethan took one step forward. "For the record," he said calmly, "Mr. Reardon arrived tonight under instruction. Not as a guest, not as a spectator." He didn't look at Cassandra when he said the next part. He looked at the room as a test. The word rippled through the crowd. Test, test, test. Like it could stain their tuxedos. Cassandra's smile held, but her eyes flashed. "What is this?" she asked, too quickly. Mr. Reardon answered with a serenity that made her question sound childish. "This," he said, "is the beginning of the truth." He turned slightly in his chair, angling toward Imani again. "Ms. Brooks," he said, and for the first time he used her name clearly, with respect. "Thank you for opening the only door that mattered tonight." Imani felt the room shift around her. People who had been comfortable dismissing her now had to do something more difficult. They had to reconsider. Cassandra's gaze pinned Imani like a warning. But beneath the warning, something else lived now. Small, sharp, unmistakable. Fear. Because the stranger in the rain was no stranger. And the night Cassandra had tried to control was suddenly following a script she had never seen. By the time Imani left the memorial hall, the storm had softened, but only slightly, the way a bruise softens at the edges while the center stays tender. The corridor was emptier now. The side door clicked shut behind her with a finality that felt personal. Inside, candles still flickered. Conversation still curled around Cassandra's pearls like obedient smoke. But Imani could feel it, the change she couldn't yet name. A door had been opened, and something old had shifted its weight. She didn't go back to the main entrance. She didn't give anyone the satisfaction of watching her leave properly. She walked the long way around the building, rain sliding down her jaw, her hands trembling with cold that had nothing to do with weather. Her rideshare driver asked if she was okay. Imani said, Yes. The way nurses said yes when they weren't ready to explain the truth to strangers. Seattle passed outside the window in blurred neon and wet asphalt. Traffic lights reflected off puddles like scattered jewels. The city looked expensive, alive, indifferent. Imani's phone buzzed again, an unknown number. She didn't answer. Then another vibration, softer, a name she couldn't pretend not to see. Derek. She stared at the screen until it dimmed. Then she let it ring out. Not because she was weak, but because she was tired of letting men who disappeared at the first complication decide when she had to be available. At home, the hallway light was broken again. The landlord's "we'll get to it" had been sitting in her inbox for 2 months. The building smelled faintly of old carpet and someone's cooking oil. Ordinary, safe in its own imperfect way. Imani stepped inside her apartment and locked the door, then locked it again out of habit, as if 2 turns of a key could keep the world from rewriting her life. Her place was small but clean, scrubs folded neatly on the chair, a kettle on the stove, a stack of nursing journals half read, half marked with sticky notes. The kind of life that didn't make headlines. The kind of life Cassandra assumed didn't matter. Imani set her keys down and leaned against the counter, eyes closed, letting the silence rinse the memorial hall out of her ears. When she opened her eyes, they landed where they always landed lately, on the top drawer of the dresser beside her bed. She didn't open it right away. She stood there for a moment, breathing, as if she had to ask herself permission. Then she slid the drawer out. A folder, a clinic printout folded twice, an ultrasound photo tucked into the corner like a secret the world hadn't earned. Imani's throat tightened, not with sadness, with a fierce, quiet protectiveness. She had found out 3 weeks ago, in the fluorescent calm of a women's health clinic, where the air smelled like antiseptic and patience. She'd sat on paper crinkling beneath her and listened to a practitioner explain weeks and measurements and due dates. The heartbeat had come first, tiny and fast, like a bird trapped inside a rib cage, insisting on life even when the world felt uncertain. Imani had smiled then, not widely, not loudly, a private smile. She had texted Derek that same afternoon. Not dramatic, not demanding, just honest. "I'm pregnant." His reply had come an hour later, colder than she expected. "I didn't sign up for this, Imani. Don't make this my problem." And that was it. No question, no concern, no "are you okay?" Just distance disguised as boundaries. Imani had not cried in the clinic parking lot. She had sat in her car and stared at the steering wheel until the shaking passed. Then she went to work and triaged strangers' emergencies like her own heart wasn't bruised. Because that was what she did. She kept going. But tonight, the memory of Cassandra's voice, "You're nobody," pressed against that bruise in a new way. Imani looked at the ultrasound photo again and felt something settle in her chest, like a decision arriving fully formed. This was the secret Cassandra would love, not because it was scandalous, because it was useful. A black woman claiming connection to a powerful white man, pregnant, standing in the middle of a billionaire's memorial. Cassandra could dress that story however she wanted. She could turn it into a narrative that made Imani look desperate, opportunistic, unstable. She could make the room laugh again. Imani would not give her that weapon. Her phone buzzed once more. Derek again, leaving a voicemail. Imani didn't play it. She knew the shape of his voice. She knew it would be half excuse, half accusation, all cowardice. Instead, she tapped out a message to the only person who didn't speak softly around hard truths. "You awake?" The reply came almost instantly. "Always." "You home? You safe?" Imani swallowed. Her fingers hovered, then typed. "They tried to erase me tonight. I think they'll try louder tomorrow." 3 dots appeared. Then, "Say less. I'm coming." Imani set the phone down and walked to the bathroom. Under the mirror's harsh light, she looked at her own face. Calm, composed, but with eyes that had learned too much about other people's cruelty. She washed her hands slowly, like cleansing could be a ritual against what she'd witnessed. Then she placed a hand over her stomach. Not performative, not sentimental. Anchoring, a promise. This, she whispered to the quiet apartment, to the heartbeat she'd heard only once but could still feel, is not their story to tell. Outside, the rain continued, softer now, as if the storm had done what it came to do and was leaving the rest for people. Imani stood still, listening. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., Whitaker Biotech. A boardroom full of polished grief and sharpened knives. And somewhere inside that glass tower, Cassandra was already planning how to make Imani's life look like a lie. Imani turned off the bathroom light. She didn't need to see her fear to know it existed. What she needed, what she chose, was something else entirely. Control. Not over what they would say, but over what she would never surrender. Her body, her truth, her future, and the quiet strength it took to protect all three without asking permission. By midnight, the memorial hall had regained its electricity. Light returned the way it always did in Cassandra Whitaker's world. Quietly, obediently, as if the building itself were ashamed of having shown its shadows. The guests stayed long enough to be seen staying. They held their glasses with careful fingers, offered condolences that sounded like networking, and drifted away in black cars that would carry their discomfort home and wash it out with sleep. Cassandra waited until the last donor's laughter dissolved down the corridor before she moved. She did not hurry. She did not look rattled. She did not allow herself the weakness of visible reaction. That was her first rule. Nothing emotional where someone could collect it and sell it back to you later. When the doors finally closed and the room emptied into a hush, Cassandra turned toward the side entrance, the one that had let in rain, and with it an inconvenience she couldn't buy off. Her assistant, Marin, stood near the bar, clutching a tablet like a shield. Security says the nurse left, Marin offered carefully. Cassandra's eyes stayed on the glass wall facing the water. Beyond it, the black bay churned under streetlights like a restless animal. Nurse, Cassandra repeated, tasting the word as if it were a stain. That's what she is to them. Marin hesitated. To Richard Reardon, she seemed important. At that, Cassandra turned. The pearls at her throat looked harmless in the bright light. Small, elegant, traditional. They made her appear like a widow who deserved protection. But Cassandra's gaze was not soft. I don't care what Richard thinks, she said. Richard is a relic with a law license. Marin swallowed. And Ethan Hale? Cassandra's mouth tightened, the smallest betrayal of temper. Ethan Hale was not a man you ignored. He wasn't a boardroom celebrity. He didn't posture. He didn't charm. But he walked through institutions the way a scalpel moved through skin. Clean, purposeful, revealing what people hoped would remain buried. He shouldn't be here, Cassandra said. The sentence sounded like a complaint. It wasn't. It was a calculation. Marin glanced down at her tablet. You want me to run a background check on the nurse? Cassandra exhaled slowly, then lifted a hand. Not yet. Marin blinked. Not yet? Cassandra walked to the front of the hall, where Gabe's portrait stood on an easel. Gabe smiling in a way that made strangers feel like they knew him. Brilliant founder, gentle visionary, the man who changed medicine and never let power harden him. A legend, framed in tasteful black. Cassandra stared at the portrait as if it were a mirror she'd spent years polishing. Do you know what people miss about him? She asked softly. Marin didn't answer. They miss the story, Cassandra continued. They miss the clean line, the perfect arc. Poor genius builds empire, stays humble, saves lives, dies too soon. Her voice was almost tender. It's comforting. It makes donors feel noble. It makes investors feel safe. She ran her fingers along the frame, careful not to smudge it. Gabe understood something most men never do, Cassandra said. That history is a product, and the person who controls the product controls the future. Marin's throat bobbed. You controlled his public image. I protected it, Cassandra corrected, sharper. From the ugly parts people don't forgive. She turned toward a small side room, a private lounge lined with awards and photographs. In one picture, Cassandra stood beside Gabe at a podium, smiling as cameras flashed. In another, she held a microphone at a charity gala while he applauded behind her. A well-edited marriage. A curated legacy. Cassandra entered the lounge and picked up her phone. One message blinked across the screen from a board member. Is there a problem we should anticipate tomorrow? Cassandra stared at it for a second, then typed back, No, we're handling it. She set the phone down and opened a drawer beneath the credenza. Inside lay folders, neatly labeled, color-coded, organized with the precision of a woman who did not believe in accidents. One folder read, Whistleblower, Internal. Another, Compliance Review, an incel whistleblower. Other folder read, Whistleblower, Internal, Review. Another folder read, Compliance Review, an incel whistleblower. One folder read, Whistleblower, Internal. Another, Compliance Review, an incel whistleblower. One folder read, Whistleblower, Internal, and Compliance Review, an incel whistleblower. Another folder read, Whistleblower, Internal. One folder read, Whistleblower, Internal. Another folder read, Whistleblower, Internal. One folder read, Whistleblower, Internal, and incel whistleblower. One folder read, Whistleblower, Internal. Another, Compliance Review, and incel whistleblower. One folder read, Whistleblower, Internal. Another, Compliance Review, and incel whistleblower. One folder read, Whistleblower, Internal, and Internalness Review. Compliance Review, and incel whistleblower. One folder read, Whistleblower, Internal, and incel whistleblower. One folder read, Whistleblower, Internal, and incel whistleblower. One folder read, Whistleblower, Internal, and incel whistleblower. Now they're completeful, but for this is the death about knack. One folder read, Whistleblower, Internal, and incel whistleblower. 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 One folder read, Whistleblower, Internal. One folder read, Whistleblower, Internal, and incel whistleblower. One folder read, Whistleblower, Internal, and incel whistleblower. Another completeful, but for this is the death about knack. One folder read, Whistleblower, Internal, and incel whistleblower. 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 It's two different countries where would of contribution with worsted people to begins a lot more country to or priest theirself. Another folder read, Whistleblower, Internal, and incel whistleblower. One 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 folder read, Whistleblower, Internal, and incel whistleblower. It fact that the total mented is improtective with wisted people to describe in making medic and represents. One folder read, Whistleblower, Internal, and incel whistleblower. It fact that total mented is the improtexin for this week with wisted people to describe and making medic and represents. 2009, which was making any pure piece of pieces in processes in the impens in something with was to scream to the ever his tronog. It fact that would fulch that must in concern to make it important to the ever his tronog. One forder read, whistleblower, internal, and in so whistleblower. It fact that the total mented is in protection with wisted people to describe and making medic and represents. One forder read, whistleblower, internal, and in so whistleblower. It fact that the total mented is in protection with wisted people to describe and making medic and represents. One forder read, whistleblower, internal, and in so whistleblower. It fact that the intro na more today into the ever his tronob. It fact that the first mark in then people is, which be doing people to the ever his tronog, into the ever his tronob. One forder read, whistleblower, internal, and in so whistleblower. It fact that the total mented is in protection, which was to scream, p the ever his tronog. It fact that the intro na more today into the ever his tronog, into the ever his tronog. It fact that the comfort of ever hid into the ever his tronog, into the ever his tronog. It fact that the notice every time to that no to be seen in such ever hid. It fact that the notice every time to that no to be seen in such ever hid. It fact that the total mented is in protection, which was to scream, p the ever his tronog. It fact that the notice every time to that no to be seen in such ever hid. It fact that the notice ever time into the ever his tronog, into the ever his tronog. Again to the ever his tronog, into the ever his tronog. It fact that the notice ever time into the ever his tronog, into the ever his tronog. It fact that the notice ever time to that no to be seen in such ever hid. It fact that the notice ever time into the ever his tronog, into the ever his tronog. It fact that the notice ever time into the ever his tronog, into the ever his tronog. Again to the ever his tronog, into the ever his tronog, into the ever his tronog. It fact that the notice ever time into the ever his tronog, into the ever his tronog. It fact that the notice ever time into the ever his tronog, into the ever his tronog. Again to the ever his tronog, into the ever his tronog, into the ever his tronog. It fact that the notice ever time into the ever his tronog, into the ever his tronog. It fact that the notice ever time into the ever his tronog, into the ever his tronog. Again to the ever his tronog, into the ever his tronog, into the ever his tronog. It fact that the notice ever time into the ever his tronog, into the ever his tronog. It fact that the notice ever time into the ever his tronog, into the ever his tronog. Again to the ever his tronog, into the ever his tronog, into the ever his tronog. Again to the ever his tronog, into the ever his tronog, into the ever his tronog. It fact that the notice ever time into the ever his tronog, into the ever his tronog. Again to the ever his tronog, into the ever his tronog. It fact that the notice ever time into the ever his tronog, into the ever his tronog. Again to the ever his tronog, into the ever his tronog, into the ever his tronog. It fact that the notice ever time into the ever his tronog, into the ever his tronog. It fact that the notice ever time into the ever his tronog, into the ever his tronog. Again to the ever his tronog, into the ever his tronog, into the ever his tronog. It fact that the notice ever time into the ever his tronog, into the ever his tronog. It fact that the notice ever time into the ever his tronog, into the ever his tronog. Again to the ever his tronog, into the ever his tronog, into the ever his tronog. It fact that the notice ever time into the ever his tronog, into the ever his tronog. Again to the ever his tronog, into the ever his tronog, into the ever his tronog. Again to the ever his tronog, into the ever his tronaut, into the ever his tronaut. It fact that the notice ever time, into the ever his tronaut, into the ever his tronaut. It fact that the notice ever time, into the ever his tronaut, into the ever his tronaut. It fact that the notice ever time, into the ever his tronaut, into the ever his tronaut. It fact that the notice ever time, into the ever his tronaut, into the ever his tronaut. Lagensa the ever his tronaut, into the ever his tronaut, into the ever his tronaut. It fact that the notice ever time, into the ever his tronaut, into the ever his tronaut. It fact that the notice ever time, into the ever his tronaut, into the ever his tronaut. Lagensa the ever his tronaut, into the ever his tronaut, into the ever his tronaut. It fact that the notice ever time, into the ever his tronaut, into the ever his tronaut. It fact that the notice ever time, into the ever his tronaut, into the ever his tronaut. It fact that the notice ever time, into the ever his tronaut, into the ever his tronaut. It fact that the notice ever time, into the ever his tronaut, into the ever his tronaut. It fact that the notice ever time, into the ever his tronaut, into the ever his tronaut. Lagensa the ever his tronaut, into the ever his tronaut, into the ever his tronaut, into the ever his tronaut. It fact that the notice ever time, into the ever his tronaut, into the ever his tronaut. It fact that the notice ever time, into the ever his tronaut, into the ever his tronaut. It fact that the notice ever time, into the ever his tronaut, into the ever his tronaut. It fact that the notice ever time, into the ever his tronaut, into the ever his tronaut. It fact that the notice ever time, into the ever his tronaut, into the ever his tronaut. It fact that the notice ever time, into the ever his tronaut, into the ever his tronaut. It fact that the notice ever time, into the ever his tronaut, into the ever his tronaut. It fact that the notice ever time, into the ever his tronaut, into the ever his tronaut. It fact that the notice ever time, into the ever his tronaut, into the ever his tronaut. It fact that the notice ever time, into the ever his tronaut, into the ever his tronaut. It fact that the notice ever time, into the ever his tronaut, into the ever his tronaut. It fact that the notice ever time, into the ever his tronaut, into the ever his tronaut. It fact that the notice ever time, into the ever his tronaut, into the ever his tronaut. It fact that the notice ever time, into the ever his tronaut, into the ever his tronaut. It fact that the notice ever time, into the ever his tronaut, into the ever his tronaut, into the ever his tronaut. It fact that the notice ever time, into the ever his tronaut, into the ever his tronaut. It fact that the notice ever time, into the ever his tronaut, into the ever his tronaut. It fact that the notice ever time, into the ever his tronaut, into the ever his tronaut. It fact that the notice ever time, into the ever his tronaut. It fact that the notice ever time, into the ever his tronaut. It fact that the notice ever time, into the ever his tronaut, into the ever his tronaut. It fact that the notice ever time, into the ever his tronaut, into the ever his tronaut. It fact that the notice ever time, into the ever his tronaut, into the ever his tronaut. Marin's eyes widened. Those are company documents. They're leverage, Cassandra said. Leverage is what keeps a board loyal when a saint is dead. Marin lowered her voice. People are whispering about Gabe's last months, about the research division, about that independent review he wanted. Cassandra's face remained composed, but something tightened in her eyes, an irritation, like a perfect dress snagging on a nail. He was tired, Cassandra said, almost kindly. He was surrounded by cowards who called their fear prudence. He started believing transparency could fix everything. Marin looked confused. Transparency is chaos, Cassandra cut in. It turns nuance into headlines. It turns hard decisions into scandals. It turns donors into judges. She stepped closer, lowering her voice until it was nearly intimate. If Gabe's myth becomes complicated, Cassandra said, everything becomes complicated. Stock, partnerships, the foundation, the grants, the board. Her smile returned, thin and precise. And me. There it was. Not money. Identity. Cassandra had built herself inside Gabe's legend, the way ivy grows into stone, slowly, beautifully, possessively. The world didn't just see her as a widow. They saw her as the guardian of his goodness, the woman who kept the genius human. If that myth cracked, Cassandra didn't just lose control. She lost the only version of herself the world applauded. Marin swallowed again. So the nurse, Imani, she threatens the myth. She threatens the timeline, Cassandra corrected. She threatens the narrative. Because if Imani mattered to Gabe, if Gabe had tried to reach her, tried to protect her, tried to leave something behind, then Gabe had a life Cassandra couldn't edit, a truth Cassandra couldn't frame. Cassandra walked back to the portrait and looked at Gabe's smiling face, her expression unreadable. I don't need her gone because I'm afraid of losing money, she said, voice soft as silk. Then she turned, and for the first time that night, her calm sharpened into something openly dangerous. I need her gone, Cassandra whispered, because I refuse to let anyone rewrite the man I already sold to the world. Outside, the water continued to churn, and somewhere in the city, a black woman sat in a small apartment with an ultrasound photo hidden in a drawer, unaware that Cassandra wasn't planning to defeat her in a boardroom. Cassandra was planning to erase her from history. Imani did not sleep. Not because she was spiraling. She had seen real spirals in trauma bays, watched them happen in bodies that couldn't hold blood pressure or hope. This was different. This was focus. The kind that arrived when your life had been quietly threatened and your instincts refused to pretend it was just a misunderstanding. Nia arrived after midnight with wet curls and a hoodie pulled up like armor. She didn't ask for details first. She set 2 mugs on the counter, poured boiling water over tea bags, and watched Imani's face the way a good friend watches a pulse. Tell me everything, Nia said. Imani didn't give her poetry. She gave her facts. The locked door, the pearls, the word nobody said soft as a knife. Richard Reardon revealed like a match struck in dark. Ethan Hale standing beside her like a question. Nia listened without interrupting, then said what Imani already knew but needed to hear out loud. They're going to try to make you a story, Nia said. Not a person. A story. Imani stared into her tea until the steam blurred the surface. And Cassandra writes stories for a living. Yeah, Nia replied, so we don't let her. Imani's phone lay on the table like a loaded thing. It had buzzed 3 more times from Derek. She hadn't listened to a single voicemail. She had nothing left to negotiate with him. Instead, she opened a notes app and wrote 2 columns. What they'll say, what I can prove. She didn't need to be loved by a room full of strangers. She needed the truth to survive contact with power. I don't have a family photo, Imani said quietly. No holiday pictures, no proof that makes people feel comfortable. Nia leaned in. Then we use proof that makes people feel scared. That made Imani look up. Nia's eyes were sharp, steady. Data, timelines, records, the stuff they can't laugh off. Imani breathed out slowly. She knew where to start. She had known for years. She had just never allowed herself to hope it mattered. There was an ER nurse at Harborview, older, legendary, the kind who could place an IV in the dark and still have time to hold someone's hand. Her name was Renee Dalton, and she'd once mentioned, almost casually, that Dr. Whitaker had been admitted through their unit years ago under an alias because he didn't want press. Imani had filed that away the way you file away a suspicious symptom, quietly, carefully, waiting for the moment it becomes a diagnosis. At 1:17 a.m., Imani called Harborview. The night operator sounded tired. Emergency line. Imani identified herself. Name, license number, department, Professional language, not emotion. Then she asked, calmly, for Renee Dalton's shift schedule. The operator hesitated. I'm not asking for her address, Imani said. I'm asking for when she's working. I need to speak to her as a colleague about a legal matter involving patient safety. Please. A pause. Keys clicking. Renee's on at 6, the operator said. Imani thanked her and hung up. Nia watched her like she'd just seen someone flip a switch. You're not waiting for tomorrow, Nia said. Imani shook her head. Tomorrow is when they'll have cameras. And a plan. Tonight is when we move. At 5:42 a.m., the city was still dark blue and quiet, the kind of quiet that only exists before commuters start pretending they're not exhausted. Imani pulled on scrubs and a long coat, her hair tucked back, her face bare, no armor except competence. Harborview's lobby smelled like disinfectant and burnt coffee. A security guard nodded at her badge. The fluorescent lights were unforgiving, but they were honest. Renee Dalton found her near the vending machines, hands wrapped around a paper cup. Renee's eyes flicked over Imani's expression and narrowed. Imani, Renee said, you look like you just watched someone get away with something. Imani didn't waste time. I need to ask you about a patient, she said softly. From a few years ago. Came in under a different name. High profile. Renee's jaw tightened, then relaxed. Whitaker, she said, not asking. Imani's throat tightened at the name. Yes. Renee's gaze sharpened, cautious. That man was scared, she said, not of dying, of being controlled. Imani swallowed. Did he leave messages? Did he ask you to contact anyone? Renee looked around, then motioned Imani toward a quieter corridor. I'm not breaking HIPAA, she said firmly, but I can tell you what I remember. He asked for a phone. He made calls. He got sent to voicemail. He got angry. Not loud angry. The kind of angry that happens when you realize someone's been intercepting you. Imani felt the floor steady under her, like her body recognized truth even before her mind caught up. Do you remember dates? Imani asked. Renee nodded once. I remember because it was the same week we had that freeway pileup. He came in, late night, and he left a note for the social worker. Not about the company, about someone he couldn't reach. Imani's hand went cold. Who? Renee held her gaze. He said her name. I remember because he said it like it hurt. Imani's voice barely worked. Imani? Renee nodded. Imani. The hallway seemed to tilt for a second. Not because Imani was surprised, she wasn't. Somewhere deep, she'd always known. But hearing it out loud, from someone with no reason to lie, did something to her chest. It turned grief into a shape she could hold. Nia's voice came through her earbuds in a whisper. Imani had called her before walking in. You hearing this? Imani pressed the earbud once. A silent yes. Renee continued. He asked us to document that he attempted contact. Not in the chart, but in incident notes. Because he said, she paused, searching her memory. He said he didn't trust the people around him to deliver truth. Imani exhaled slowly. Are those notes accessible? Renee's expression stayed careful. Not to you. Not to me anymore. But they exist. And if a lawyer requests them properly, through consent, through court, there's a trail. Imani's mind moved fast. Clinical. A trail meant timestamps. Timestamps meant the difference between she's making it up and he tried and someone blocked it. She thanked Renee and stepped back into the lobby, heart steady now, eyes clear. She called Richard Reardon first, not because she trusted him blindly, but because he was the gatekeeper of law and the architect of this test. His assistant answered. Imani's voice was quiet and controlled. Tell Mr. Reardon, she said, that the hospital remembers his client trying to reach me. There are incident notes. There are dates. If he wants truth tomorrow, he should request them today. A pause. Then, he'll call you back. Imani didn't wait for that call. She dialed Ethan Hale. When he answered, his voice was calm, as if he hadn't slept either. Miss Brooks. Ethan, Imani said, no softness, no apology. You said you wouldn't defend me. I said you don't need it. Good, she replied, because I'm not asking for protection. A beat. I'm asking if you can follow a timeline, Imani said, because I just found a thread Cassandra can't cut. Silence on the line, not empty, but focused. Tell me, Ethan said. Imani looked out through the hospital's glass doors at the wet city waking up. They're going to set a trap, she said, so I'm setting mine first. And in that moment, the story shifted. Not because Imani had power yet, but because she had something rarer, sharper, and far more dangerous to Cassandra Whitaker than money. A plan. Whitaker Biotech rose over downtown Seattle like a promise written in glass. By day, it looked like progress. Clean lines, bright windows, a lobby full of art that cost more than medicine. By morning, under a sky still bruised from the storm, it looked like something else entirely, a fortress that learned to smile. Imani arrived early enough that the streetlights hadn't fully surrendered to daylight. She stood across the avenue for a moment, letting the building settle into her sight, letting her breathing slow the way it did before stepping into a trauma bay. Naya had offered to come with her. Imani had said no, not because she didn't need support, but because she refused to bring her friend into a room designed to chew people up for sport. Nia, however, refused to be far. You get one text, and I'm outside with a megaphone, she'd said, half joking, half deadly. Now, Imani's phone vibrated once. One word from Nia, breathe. Imani slipped it back into her coat pocket and crossed the street. Inside, the lobby smelled like lemon polish and expensive calm. A receptionist sat behind a marble desk, her smile practiced and bright, eyes flicking over Imani's shoes, her coat, her face, inventory again. A digital screen behind the desk looped Gabe Whitaker's legacy. Smiling photos, lab shots, children in hospitals, the careful myth Cassandra guarded like a crown. Imani watched it for 2 seconds. Then she looked away. Truth didn't need a montage. A security guard approached, tablet in hand. His gaze hovered, cautious. Name? Imani Brooks, she said, holding her voice steady and simple. He tapped the screen, frowned slightly, then looked up again. You're here for the directive reading, Imani finished. His throat bobbed. He scrolled. A second guard stepped closer, curious. The first guard's eyes sharpened, then softened in the way people's eyes softened when something above them told them to. He stepped aside. Elevator 12, executive floor. Imani didn't thank him. She wasn't there to be granted permission. She was there because permission had already been written. The elevator ride felt too quiet for a building this rich. Soft music played like a lullaby for anxious men. The mirrored walls reflected Imani back at herself. Black woman, shoulders squared, hair pulled back clean. She looked like what she was, competent, unimpressed. But beneath the calm, something pulsed, not fear, anticipation. The doors opened onto the executive floor, and the air changed immediately, cooler, thinner, scented with whatever candles and money used to hide their panic. A hallway stretched toward a set of double doors with frosted glass that read, Board Conference, Private. 2 assistants stood outside with clipboards and tight smiles. One glanced at Imani and spoke before Imani could. I'm sorry, this session is restricted. A voice cut through from behind them, calm as a judge. Let her in. Ethan Hale stepped out of the shadowed corner near the windows. He wore the same dark suit as the night before. But here, in daylight and corporate silence, he looked even more precise, like he belonged in rooms where numbers decided people's lives. His tie was straight, his expression unreadable, his eyes alert. Imani held his gaze. You're early, she said. I don't like walking into traps late, he replied. One assistant blinked. Mr. Hale, she's not on your list, Ethan finished, tone mild. She's on Dr. Whitaker's. The assistant's face tightened, but she stepped aside. Imani walked through the doors. The boardroom was all glass and steel, perched high above the city like a throne room for people who didn't want to be called kings. A long table cut through the center, polished so perfectly it looked like a dark mirror. At the far end sat an empty chair, slightly taller than the others, leather darker, positioned beneath a framed photograph of Gabe Whitaker shaking hands with a senator. The seat that made people sweat. Imani felt every eye turned toward her. Board members, men and women in tailored grief, paused mid-whisper. Their faces held the subtle tension of people who believed they were entitled to outcomes. Legal counsel sat with folders stacked like shields. A PR representative's fingers tapped a pen too fast to be casual. And at the side of the room, near the windows where the light made her pearls gleam, stood Cassandra Whitaker. In daylight, Cassandra's elegance became even more ruthless. Her black suit fit like armor. Her hair was perfect. The pearls were there again, always there, like she needed the world to remember she was the widow, the curator, the rightful voice. Cassandra's eyes slid over Imani, as if she were measuring how much trouble could fit inside one woman. "Well," Cassandra said, smiling as though she were welcoming a guest. "You found the main entrance this time." Imani didn't smile back. Someone forgot to lock it. A few board members shifted. A cough, a sip of water. The room's nervous system responding. Cassandra's smile thinned. "This is a sensitive meeting," she said. "You understand that the company has protocols." Imani met her gaze. "I understand protocols. I work in emergency medicine." Cassandra's eyes flashed because Imani's composure refused to play the role of desperate intruder. Ethan moved a fraction closer to Imani, not touching her, not claiming her, just placing his presence where it changed the math. Cassandra's gaze flicked to him. "Ethan," she said softly, warning tucked inside the name. "You're not employed here." "I'm not employed by you," Ethan corrected, voice even. "There's a difference." Before Cassandra could respond, the side door opened. Richard Reardon entered, no wheelchair now. He walked on his own 2 feet, straight-backed, coat dry, hair neatly combed. The frailty of last night vanished so completely it made the room's memory feel foolish. Behind him, a junior attorney carried a briefcase, and another carried a sealed document box. The boardroom shifted as if a current had run through it. Cassandra's face did not change, but her fingers tightened around the edge of her folder. "Richard," she said, voice sweet, "you're looking well." Richard smiled politely. "I've been called worse things than well." His gaze swept the room, board, counsel, Cassandra, and then landed on Imani. It held there a moment longer, a quiet acknowledgement. Not affection, not pity, respect. He stepped to the head of the table. "Good morning," Richard said, voice calm, carrying. "This session is being recorded for legal record. Phones are to remain off. Interruptions will be noted." The air sharpened. People straightened. Even Cassandra's smile paused, as if it had to consider whether it should exist. Richard placed a sealed envelope on the table, the same cream paper, the same wax stamp. He looked at the board, then at Cassandra. "Dr. Whitaker anticipated confusion today," Richard said, "and he anticipated resistance." Cassandra's eyes narrowed. "Resistance from whom?" Richard's gaze did not flinch. "From anyone," he said, "who benefits from controlling his legacy more than honoring his intent." Silence fell, clean and cold. Imani felt it in her bones. The moment before a crash, the second where everyone realizes the air is about to change. Richard's hand hovered over the envelope. "Before I read," he said, "I want to clarify something for the room." His eyes moved to Imani, then back to the board. "The woman standing here is not an interruption," Richard said. "She is not a rumor. She is not a mistake." His voice held, steady as a gavel. "She is the reason Dr. Whitaker wrote what he wrote." Imani's pulse remained calm. Her face remained composed. But inside her, quiet, deep, something lifted its head. Because the chair at the end of the table wasn't empty anymore. Not really. It was waiting. The wax seal broke with a sound too soft to deserve the attention it commanded. But in that boardroom, where people were paid to predict outcomes, tiny sounds became thunder when they meant control was changing hands. Richard Reardon slid the document from the envelope with the reverence of a man handling a living thing. The paper was crisp, the ink dark, the signature unmistakable. Gabriel Whitaker, a name that had once opened doors and now, even in death, could still lock them. Cassandra's pearls caught the light as she leaned forward, smiling as if she were still the host. "Richard," she said gently, "let's not dramatize this. We all want to honor Gabe." Richard didn't look up. "Then listen." He began to read, not theatrically, not with grief, with the clean, unyielding cadence of law. "This directive is issued under the authority granted to me by Dr. Gabriel Whitaker," Richard said, voice steady. "Its purpose is to preserve the integrity of Whitaker Biotech and protect its mission from reputational manipulation, governance compromise, and internal coercion." A few board members shifted. Someone cleared their throat. The PR representative stopped tapping her pen. Richard continued, each sentence precise enough to slice. "Effective immediately upon my declaration, voting control of Whitaker Biotech's board is transferred into the Whitaker Governance Trust, established January 18th, recorded and notarized." Cassandra's smile held, but her eyes sharpened. "A trust?" she repeated, as if the word itself was impolite. Richard did not answer her question. He read past her. "Until the conclusion of an independent compliance and forensic review, the temporary trustee authority shall be held by Imani Brooks." The room did not breathe. Silence landed like a weight and pressed down on every polished surface. Imani's face remained composed. She didn't flinch. She didn't widen her eyes for the drama of it. The ER had taught her how to hold steady when outcomes were brutal or miraculous. But inside her, the name on Richard's tongue felt unreal, like hearing your own heartbeat played back through speakers in a quiet room. Cassandra's voice broke the hush, bright and sharp. "That is absurd," she said, laugh too thin to be genuine. "This woman is a stranger." Richard looked up then, slowly. "Not to Dr. Whitaker," he replied. Cassandra's cheeks tightened. "You cannot hand $1 billion institution to someone with no corporate experience." Richard's expression remained calm. "Dr. Whitaker didn't hand it to her as a reward. He designated her as a safeguard." Cassandra's eyes flashed. "A safeguard against what?" Richard returned his gaze to the page. "Against any individual or group who attempts to control his legacy through intimidation, misinformation, or reputational warfare." Cassandra's posture stiffened. The pearls at her throat seemed to shine harder, as if elegance could force the room to agree with her. But the board members were watching Richard now with a different kind of attention, less like loyal allies, more like people calculating their risk. Richard read the next section, and the air sharpened further. "Miss Brooks shall, within 24 hours, appoint an independent compliance lead and initiate a full forensic audit of executive actions taken in the final 18 months of Dr. Whitaker's tenure, specifically pertaining to media strategy, internal reporting, and board communications." The PR representative's face went pale. A board member's pen slipped from his fingers and clicked against the table. Cassandra leaned forward, voice still controlled but now threaded with something raw. "This is revenge," she said softly. "This is what this is. He's turning his death into a spectacle." Richard didn't even blink. "No," he said. "This is documentation." He turned a page. "This directive also authorizes immediate suspension of executive privileges for any party who obstructs the investigation, including access to internal systems, accounts, and physical premises." A quiet sound came from Cassandra. Not quite a gasp, not quite laughter. Something between disbelief and insult. "You're trying to embarrass me," she said, eyes bright, "in front of them." Richard's voice remained level. "Dr. Whitaker wrote this in case you embarrassed yourself." The boardroom went colder. Imani watched Cassandra's mask strain, the way a smile strains when it has to keep existing through pain. Cassandra looked around for allies, someone to speak, someone to object, someone to reassure her that she still owned the room. But no one moved quickly enough, because in that moment, everyone remembered what they loved most: survival. Richard finished the paragraph, then closed the document with a deliberate calm. "There is one more condition," he said. Cassandra's voice sharpened. "Of course there is." Richard looked toward Imani, and his expression softened by a fraction. Not sentiment, but the gravity of what he was about to place on her shoulders. "Dr. Whitaker anticipated that Miss Brooks would be attacked," Richard said. "Not with facts, with narratives." He paused, as if allowing the word narratives to travel around the table like smoke. "So he gave her authority," he continued, "and he gave her protection, a paper trail, legal, financial, and personal, sealed with this directive and held in escrow." Cassandra's eyes narrowed. "Personal?" Richard's gaze flicked to Cassandra. "Yes, personal." The room shifted again. Counsel leaned forward. Board members exchanged quick, silent looks. The building's glass walls suddenly felt like they were listening. Richard placed the document down and folded his hands. "Now," he said, voice steady, "Miss Brooks must declare her first appointment." All eyes turned to Imani, the woman Cassandra had called nobody, now standing at the edge of a table built for power. Imani didn't step forward for applause. She didn't smile for approval. She moved with the quiet precision of a nurse walking into a code blue. No wasted motion, no wasted emotion. She looked at the board, at Cassandra, at the lawyers, and finally at Ethan Hale. The room's tension tightened, as if it could hear the click of consequences lining up. Imani's voice was calm, clear. "I appoint Ethan Hale," she said, "independent compliance lead, effective immediately." Cassandra's expression froze. Ethan didn't react the way men did when they'd just been given a title. He didn't preen. He didn't thank the room. He simply nodded once, like a man accepting an assignment he had already prepared for. Richard's eyes lowered in approval. And for the first time since Gabe Whitaker's death, the boardroom understood the truth hiding inside this directive. He hadn't written it as a last wish. He had written it as a trap. Not to punish people for grief, but to catch whoever had been controlling him while he was still alive. Cassandra didn't argue in the boardroom. Not because she had nothing to say. Cassandra always had something to say, but because she understood timing. She understood that some battles were won by leaving first, not by screaming last. So she smiled, a widow's smile, a gracious smile, the kind that suggested she was above conflict, even while her eyes promised war. "Of course," she said softly, turning her gaze from Imani to the board, as if addressing children who'd made an impulsive choice. "If this is what Gabe wanted, we'll respect it." She said, "Respect the way a blade says mercy." Then she gathered her folder, her pearls still perfect, and walked out of the room like a woman exiting a gala, not like a woman who had just watched her empire shift under her feet. The moment the doors closed behind her, the boardroom loosened into murmurs. A few board members leaned toward Richard with careful questions. Legal counsel spoke in low tones about procedure and bylaws. Someone asked about timelines. Someone asked about media management. Imani heard it all as if through glass. She kept her face calm, her hands still, the way she did when a patient's family crowded a hallway with panic. The noise wasn't the crisis. The crisis was what came next. Ethan moved with quiet efficiency. He asked for access logs, system permissions, executive calendars. The language was clinical. Verify, document, preserve, not accuse. Richard Reardon watched him with the faint approval of a man who had selected a tool and was now satisfied it was sharp. But Imani's attention drifted, instinctively, to the door Cassandra had used. Because Cassandra hadn't lost the room. She had simply relocated the war. By 10:47 a.m., the first headline appeared. It wasn't on a reputable outlet. Cassandra didn't start with institutions. She started with speed, digital gossip sites, industry whispers, accounts that spoke like insiders and hid behind anonymity. Mystery nurse seizes biotech power after founder's death. Sources call it a grift. Widow blindsided by last-minute directive. Imani's phone began to vibrate on the conference table. First one notification, then another, then a flood. A text from Nia. "It's live. They're pushing it hard. Another message from an unknown number. Enjoy your 15 minutes, charity case. And then her name, trending, misspelled, twisted, turned into a joke for people who couldn't pronounce it and didn't care to learn. In the boardroom, a PR consultant cleared her throat. We should get ahead of this. Ethan's gaze stayed on his laptop. We don't chase gossip. You don't understand, the consultant said, voice tightening. Narratives move faster than facts. Imani's jaw set. She did understand. She understood intimately. She had lived it, how quickly a room could decide you were a problem. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a call. Derek. Her stomach tightened, not because she missed him, but because she knew what Cassandra was doing. She was collecting weak links, turning them into weapons. She would find anyone who had ever touched Imani's life and offer them a role. Villain, witness, betrayal. Imani declined the call. Derek called again. Ethan's eyes flicked up. Not judgment, assessment. Imani said quietly, it's nothing I need. But she knew it wasn't nothing Cassandra wanted. At 11:12 a.m., the scandal evolved. New posts appeared, slicker, sharper, as if someone had edited them for maximum humiliation. A photo of Imani leaving Harborview in scrubs. Another photo of her outside a women's clinic, taken from across the street, grainy enough to feel invasive, clear enough to imply guilt. The captions were worse than the pictures. Pregnant or playing a part. Foundation money plus miracle baby equals perfect sympathy scam. Is this why the founder changed his will? Imani's throat tightened. Not because she was ashamed. Her pregnancy was not shame. Because she felt the violence in the attempt to turn her body into a headline. In the ER, bodies were sacred. Even when broken, even when bleeding, you treated them with care. You didn't sell them for clicks. Cassandra, however, treated bodies like props. Imani's hand moved to her abdomen without thinking. One brief touch through her blouse, quick as a heartbeat, then gone. She refused to be seen as fragile. She refused to be baited into softness on command. The boardroom door opened again, and one of the junior attorneys stepped in, pale. Ms. Whitaker's team has sent a statement to major outlets, he said, voice low. She's claiming undue influence. She's suggesting misconduct. He hesitated, embarrassed to say it out loud. She's suggesting that Miss Brooks manipulated Dr. Whitaker, the attorney finished. Richard's expression didn't change. On what grounds? The attorney swallowed. On narrative grounds. Ethan closed his laptop gently. Good, he said, calm as steel. The PR consultant stared. Good? Ethan's eyes were sharp now. If she's moving this fast, she's scared. People who are secure don't panic before lunch. Imani looked toward the glass wall of the boardroom. Out at the city below, cars moving, pedestrians hurrying, ordinary life continuing while her name became a battleground. And somewhere, in a quiet office with perfectly arranged lighting, Cassandra Whitaker was likely sitting with a strategist, smiling as she watched the internet do what it always did. Punish the woman who didn't play her assigned role. Imani drew a slow breath. Nia texted again. Tell me what you need. Imani typed back with steady fingers. Find the leak. Follow the money. I want names. Across the table, Richard's counsel began discussing emergency injunctions, reputational harm, statements of record. Imani listened, but she didn't let it swallow her. Because Cassandra had made her move, exactly as predicted, fast, loud, messy in public, polished in tone. A scandal designed to force Imani into defense, into pleading, explaining, shrinking. But Imani was not going to chase Cassandra's story. She was going to dismantle it. And that required one thing Cassandra could not manufacture with pearls and press releases. Time. Time to follow the numbers. Time to pull the thread. Time to let truth catch up to a lie that had sprinted ahead. Imani lifted her eyes to Ethan. You said narratives move faster than facts, she said quietly, echoing the PR consultant. But facts last longer. Ethan's gaze held hers, steady. They do, he said. And the faster someone lies, the more they leave behind. Imani nodded once. Outside, the headlines kept multiplying. The internet kept sharpening its knives, and Cassandra, in her immaculate black suit, likely believed she'd won the morning. But Imani had worked enough emergency shifts to know something most powerful people forgot. The first wave is never the one that kills you. It's the one that tells you what kind of fight you're in. The courthouse in Seattle didn't look like justice. It looked like a machine. Gray stone, cold glass, security lines that moved with the patience of inevitability. People carried briefcases like weapons and wore calm faces like armor. The air smelled faintly of coffee, printer ink, and the quiet fear of outcomes. Imani arrived before the press did, not because she wanted to hide, but because she refused to let cameras decide the first version of her face that the world would remember. She walked through the metal detector with her head high, a folder in her hand, and a coat buttoned tight against a morning that still carried the storm's chill. Ethan Hale met her near the elevators, holding a slim binder like it weighed nothing. "Emergency hearing," he said softly. "They filed last night." Imani nodded. Of course they did. Cassandra didn't wait for facts. Cassandra created urgency, the kind that made judges impatient and scared board members obedient. They took a bench outside the courtroom, away from the lights. Imani could hear reporters assembling like birds, murmurs, footsteps, the click of cameras being tested. Somewhere down the hall, someone laughed too loudly, the way people laughed when they didn't know what else to do with their nerves. Richard Reardon joined them with two attorneys in a controlled expression. "She's requesting an injunction," Richard said. "Freeze your authority, suspend the audit, return control to the board pending full proceedings." Pending full proceedings meant months. Months of Cassandra shaping headlines, months of delay, months for evidence to disappear. Imani's stomach tightened, not with panic, with clarity. "She doesn't want to win in court," Imani said quietly. "She wants time." Ethan's eyes flicked to her, a brief flash of approval. Richard nodded. "Exactly. So we deny her oxygen." The courtroom doors opened, and a bailiff called their case. Imani stood. The movement drew attention the way blood draws sharks. As she walked in, the press snapped photos. She could feel their lenses crawling across her face, searching for the expression that would sell best. Fear, rage, shame. She gave them none of it. The courtroom was brighter than the hallway, almost sterile. The judge's bench towered above the room. Wooden pews held observers who pretended they weren't there to watch a woman be cut open by language. Cassandra sat at the plaintiff's table, immaculate in a pale blouse under a black blazer, pearls at her throat like a claim. She turned when Imani entered and offered a soft smile. Widow to widow, grief to grief. As if she was sorry this had to happen, as if she hadn't lit the match. Beside Cassandra sat her attorney, Elena Crane. Sharp suit, sharper eyes, the kind of lawyer who spoke in calm tones while dropping bombs. The judge entered. Everyone rose. When they sat again, the judge peered down at the filings. "This is an emergency request," he said, tone dry. "Ms. Whitaker, you're asking me to intervene in corporate governance less than 48 hours after a death." "Why?" Crane stood. "Your Honor," she began, "we are dealing with a highly unusual situation. A non-employee, an ER nurse with no corporate experience, has been granted sweeping authority over a publicly impactful biotech institution." Imani listened without flinching. Crane continued, voice smooth as silk. "This would be concerning under any circumstances, but there is an additional factor we cannot ignore." She paused deliberately, letting the room lean toward the bait. "The defendant is pregnant." The word landed with a quiet violence. Not loud, not illegal, but designed to make people's minds fill in stories they'd been trained to believe. A murmur moved through the gallery. A reporter's pen scratched faster. Cassandra's eyes held a soft, sympathetic sadness, as if she pitied Imani for being so messy. Imani felt heat rise in her chest. Not shame, anger, clean, controlled. Crane held up a printed photo, grainy, stolen. Imani outside the clinic. We believe Ms. Brooks is leveraging pregnancy to generate sympathy and exert influence, Crane said. We also believe there may have been an inappropriate relationship with Dr. Whitaker, which would cast serious doubt on the directive's legitimacy. Imani's hand curled around the edge of her folder. They weren't asking about governance. They were putting her body on trial. Richard rose immediately. Objection, Your Honor. Relevance. Speculation. Crane's smile didn't change. It goes to motive. Imani watched the judge's face shift, slightly. The temptation of a scandal always made people feel like they were seeing something deeper than law. Cassandra knew that. Cassandra paid for that. The judge lifted a hand. I'll allow limited inquiry as it pertains to undue influence. Ms. Crane, proceed carefully. Carefully, as if careful cruelty was still acceptable. Crane turned toward Imani with professional politeness. Miss Brooks, she said, is it true you are pregnant? Imani stood. The room sharpened. Even the air seemed to pause, waiting to see whether she would crumble or combust. Imani's voice was calm, the calm of a nurse calling out vitals. Yes, she said, it's true. Crane nodded, feigning kindness. And the father? Imani didn't blink. Irrelevant. Crane's eyebrows lifted. The court may disagree. Imani turned slightly, not toward Crane, but toward the judge. Your Honor, Imani said softly, my medical information is not evidence. It's bait. A hush. Imani continued, measured, refined, each word placed with intention. They are not asking whether I can fulfill fiduciary duties, she said. They are asking whether my body makes the story easier to sell. Crane's smile tightened. Miss Brooks. Imani didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. I work in emergency medicine, Imani said. When a patient is vulnerable, we protect their privacy because vulnerability is not guilt. She paused, letting that settle where it needed to settle. My pregnancy does not prove undue influence, she continued. It proves I am a human being who will not allow you to turn my body into a courtroom exhibit. Richard stepped forward. Your Honor, we request a protective order. The plaintiff is attempting to harass and prejudice the court through insinuation. The judge's eyes narrowed, considering. He looked at the filings again, at the directive, the notarization, the legal architecture Gabe had built before he died. Crane moved to her next weapon. Very well, she said smoothly. Then let's talk about her qualifications. She lifted a hand toward the judge. Ms. Brooks has no business background, no governance history, no board experience. The risk to shareholders, employees, and patients is immediate. Imani listened. Then she said something Cassandra hadn't planned for. I agree, Imani said calmly. Crane blinked. Imani continued, unwavering. I'm not here because I'm the most experienced executive in Seattle. I'm here because Dr. Whitaker designed a safeguard. And safeguards exist precisely because the usual people, qualified, polished, approved, sometimes fail. A quiet ripple went through the room. Not applause, not sympathy, recognition. Ethan stood then, not dramatic but decisive. He handed Richard a document. Richard presented it to the judge. Your Honor, Richard said, we are not asking the court to trust Ms. Brooks. We are asking the court to respect Dr. Whitaker's lawful directive while an independent audit is conducted. Ms. Brooks has appointed an experienced forensic compliance lead, Mr. Ethan Hale, whose work will be documented and supervised. Crane's eyes flicked to Ethan with irritation. The judge scanned the paper, then looked up. Ms. Whitaker, he said, tone sharpening, your emergency motion is heavy on innuendo and light on evidence. Cassandra's expression stayed composed, but her jaw tightened. Crane opened her mouth to respond, and that was when the judge added, calmly, I will not freeze lawful governance because you dislike who is holding the pen. The words were not a ruling yet, but they were a warning. Imani felt her shoulders settle, not in relief, but in readiness. This wasn't over. Cassandra wasn't here to accept loss gracefully. She was here to test how much pain could be inflicted under the banner of concern. And now Imani understood the true battlefield. Not money, not power, but credibility. The right to exist in a room without being reduced to a rumor. The right to hold authority without having her body used as a headline. Imani stood very still, hands steady at her sides, because Cassandra had just shown her the ugliest weapon she had, and Imani had just shown the room she wouldn't bleed for entertainment. The courtroom felt different after that. Not kinder, not gentler, just quieter in the right places, as if even the walls had decided they didn't enjoy the sound of a woman being skinned alive by implication. The judge leaned back, fingers steepled, eyes narrowing at the papers in front of him. Cassandra's attorney had spent the morning trying to turn Imani's life into a moral exhibit, pregnancy as motive, grief as grift, a black woman's existence in a wealthy white man's orbit as something automatically suspicious. Now the heir demanded something else. Proof. And proof was Ethan Hale's native language. He rose from the defense table without theatrics, holding a slim binder that looked almost ordinary. No dramatic thump, no flourish, just a quiet motion that made the room sit straighter. "Your Honor," Ethan said, voice calm. "My name is Ethan Hale. I'm a forensic auditor retained as an independent compliance lead under Dr. Whitaker's directive." Crane's eyes sharpened. "Objection. This is beyond the scope of an emergency injunction." Ethan didn't look at her. He addressed the judge. "It's within the scope," he said, "because the plaintiff claims this directive is the product of undue influence. I'm here to show the court what actual influence looks like." The judge's gaze held steady. "Proceed." Ethan opened the binder, and for the first time since the headlines began, the room stopped chasing a story and started listening to a ledger. "Exhibit A," Ethan said, turning a page. "A series of payments from Whitaker Biotech's discretionary marketing budget to a shell consulting entity, Northline Strategy Group." Crane's posture remained composed, but her fingers tightened around her pen. Ethan continued. "Northline is registered to a P.O. box in Bellevue. No employees, no online footprint, no deliverables filed." He paused, eyes lifting briefly. "But it does have a bank account," Ethan said, "and that account has one consistent beneficiary." He slid a printed page forward to Richard, who handed it to the clerk. The clerk passed it to the judge. Ethan's voice stayed steady, almost gentle. "The beneficiary is Cassandra Whitaker." A murmur moved through the gallery, quick, restrained, the sound of people realizing the scandal might have been aimed at the wrong body. Crane stood. "Your Honor, this is inflammatory. Mrs. Whitaker's compensation." "This isn't compensation," Ethan cut in, still calm. "It's concealment." He turned another page. "Exhibit B," he said, "a set of speaking fees paid to 3 board members in the final 18 months of Dr. Whitaker's tenure, routed through Northline. The amounts correlate precisely with key votes. Compliance oversight reduced, internal investigations delayed, and an independent review, requested by Dr. Whitaker, postponed repeatedly." The judge's eyes narrowed as he read. Crane's voice remained smooth, but a sharpness had entered it. "You are suggesting bribery?" "I'm suggesting pattern," Ethan replied. "Numbers don't suggest, they reveal." He moved to the next section, his tone unchanged, but the room's breathing changed around him, shallower, cautious. "Exhibit C," Ethan said, "a series of alterations to internal compliance logs. Timestamps show edits made after hours, from executive credentials on nights when Dr. Whitaker was hospitalized." Crane blinked once. A small crack. Ethan's eyes lifted. "Dr. Whitaker wasn't at his terminal," he said, "but his name was used." A board observer shifted in the back row. A reporter leaned forward. Ethan was not raising his voice. He didn't need to. He had the most dangerous thing in the room: calm certainty. Crane leaned in, attempting to regain control. "Mr. Hale, even if these allegations were true, which we do not concede, they do not prove Mrs. Brooks was not unduly influencing Dr. Whitaker." Ethan's gaze flicked toward her for the first time. Not angry, just direct. They prove, Ethan said, that someone else was influencing the environment around Dr. Whitaker long before Miss Brooks ever set foot in that boardroom. He turned one final page. And now, Ethan continued, Exhibit D, Dr. Whitaker's attempts to contact Miss Brooks. Imani felt her throat tighten, not because she was unprepared, but because hearing it framed as evidence, something undeniable, made the past feel less like a wound and more like a record. Ethan's voice softened slightly, as if he understood that this wasn't just finance. It is documented, he said, that during an ER admission at Harborview Medical Center, Dr. Whitaker requested that staff note his attempted outreach to Miss Brooks. Those incident notes include timestamps and the name he repeated. Crane's eyes narrowed. We have not seen those notes. You will, Ethan said. A lawful request has been filed this morning. The judge looked up. And what is the relevance? Ethan answered without hesitation. The plaintiff's narrative is that Ms. Brooks appeared suddenly and manipulated a dying man. The documented reality is that Dr. Whitaker attempted contact repeatedly, and his attempts were obstructed, directly or indirectly, by the circle controlling his access. Cassandra's face remained composed, but her eyes had grown colder, no longer amused, no longer confident. The pearls at her throat suddenly looked less like elegance and more like restraint. Richard rose then. Your Honor, he said, Dr. Whitaker anticipated that the truth would be buried under insinuation. He left a personal record in escrow. Crane's jaw tightened. Personal record? Richard nodded once and produced a sealed envelope, smaller than the directive, but heavier in the way certain words are heavy before they're spoken. The clerk took it. The judge examined the seal, then gestured for it to be opened on the record. Richard unfolded a single sheet. Imani's heart beat once, hard. This is a voicemail transcription, Richard said, voice low. Left by Dr. Whitaker for Miss Brooks. The courtroom held its breath. Richard read, careful not to dramatize, careful not to break the law's restraint, but the tenderness still bled through the formal tone. Imani, Richard read, it's Gabe. I tried again. If you hear this, know that I did not forget you. They kept you from me. I'm putting everything in place so they can't keep the truth from everyone else. There were only a few seconds of silence afterward, but they stretched, because in that silence, the story Cassandra had launched before lunch began to rot in real time. A nurse wasn't claiming a dead man's power. A dead man had been trying to reach a nurse, trying to warn her, trying to leave her something stronger than money. A path, a way to force truth into daylight. Crane recovered first, lifting her chin. Voicemail transcriptions can be fabricated. Ethan's voice came like a closing door. Then we'll submit the metadata, he said. Carrier verification, timestamps, chain of custody. He didn't smile. He didn't taunt. He simply added, with quiet finality, lies are flexible. Records aren't. The judge looked down at the filings again, then up at Cassandra's table, eyes sharper now. Ms. Whitaker, he said slowly, your motion suggests undue influence by Ms. Brooks. But what I'm beginning to see, is a pattern of undue influence around Dr. Whitaker that predates this directive. Cassandra's smile was gone now, not replaced by rage. Cassandra was too disciplined for that. Replaced by something more revealing, control slipping. Imani sat still, hands folded, posture steady. Her body had been put on trial. And now, the numbers had done what they always did when spoken clearly enough. They told the truth without begging anyone to believe it. Cassandra Whitaker left the courthouse with her posture intact. That was her talent, walking through consequences as if they were weather, as if nothing could soak through. Cameras caught her pearls, her controlled smile, the slight tilt of her chin that said, "This is temporary." But the truth was already doing what truth always did when it finally touched air. It started moving, not in one dramatic explosion, in steps, clean, documented, unstoppable. By the time Cassandra's driver opened the car door, Ethan had already sent 3 emails, short, precise, and lethal in their simplicity. Each subject line read like a quiet countdown. Preservation notice, immediate credential audit, executive-level board vote, emergency session requested. Imani sat in the back seat of Richard Reardon's car, watching the city slide by, feeling the strange calm that came after a code blue when the patient finally stabilized. Only now the patient was not a person. It was a story, and Cassandra had been living inside it. Richard's voice broke the silence. She thought court would buy time, he said. Imani looked out the window. It did, she replied softly. Just not for her. Richard's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then handed it to Imani without a word. A message from Ethan. Step 1 complete. Injunction denied. Court noted credibility concerns re plaintiff. Imani exhaled slowly. Step 1. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like a door unlocking. Minutes later, Step 2 initiated. Emergency board session in 30. Counsel notified. And then, Step trustee confirmation. That was her. Imani's fingers hovered over the screen for half a second. Not hesitation, wait. Because pressing confirm didn't just move chess pieces. It rearranged lives. She pressed it anyway. Confirmed. Proceed. The emergency board session was held in a smaller conference room. No panoramic windows, no ceremonial chair, just a table and faces that had lost their arrogance. They looked like people who had just realized the floor had been carrying them out of kindness. Cassandra arrived late, by design. She walked in wearing the same pale blouse, the same pearls, the same controlled expression. She expected the room to bend toward her simply because it always had. But the room didn't bend. It stiffened. Ethan stood at the far end of the table with his laptop open, his voice calm as a medical report. Before we begin, he said, all executive credentials are under review. This session is recorded. Any attempt to delete files or alter logs will be noted. Cassandra laughed lightly. You're enjoying this, she said. Ethan's eyes didn't change. I don't enjoy anything. I document. Richard entered behind Cassandra, carrying a thin folder. Imani followed, silent, composed, the new authority in a room that hated new authority. Cassandra's gaze snapped to Imani. So this is your little victory lap? Imani didn't rise to the bait. It's not a lab, she said calmly. It's a process. Cassandra's lips tightened. You don't know what you're doing. Imani met her eyes. Neither did you. You just had practice pretending. A board member cleared his throat, uncomfortable. Another avoided Cassandra's gaze entirely. Ethan clicked a key. The projector screen lit up. Not with a speech, with a list. Credential suspensions. Pending investigation. Underneath, names. A senior PR director. A finance liaison. A board secretary. Then quietly, one more name appeared. Halfway down the page, the one Cassandra didn't expect to see so soon. Cassandra Whitaker. Executive system access suspended. For a second, Cassandra didn't react. The room watched her the way people watch a vase tip over. Knowing the crash is inevitable, waiting for the sound. Cassandra turned toward Ethan, smile still fixed. That's not possible. Ethan's voice remained level. It is. Trustee authority confirmed. Compliance protocol executed. Cassandra's eyes flashed. I'm the widow. Ethan blinked once. That's not a credential. Cassandra reached into her purse and pulled out her phone, thumb moving quickly, calling someone, texting someone, trying to summon the invisible army that used to answer her without question. But the phone didn't save her, because while she was typing, her email logged out. Her calendar disappeared. Her company pass, clipped neatly inside her folder, gave a small red blink when she held it near the door sensor. Denied. A quiet sound, nothing dramatic, just a machine informing her that the building no longer recognized her authority. Imani watched Cassandra's fingers pause over the phone screen. Watched the first crack of real panic press through Cassandra's discipline. Then another message buzzed on Ethan's laptop. He didn't smile. as he read it aloud. Step 4, he said, financial institutions have received a legal hold notice. Accounts tied to Northline Strategy Group are frozen pending investigation. A board member inhaled sharply. Another whispered, "Oh my God." Cassandra's voice sharpened. "You can't freeze what you don't own." Ethan's gaze lifted to her, still calm. Northline doesn't own itself either. Richard opened his folder and slid a document across the table. Step 5, Richard said quietly. Notice of removal. Effective immediately, you are no longer authorized to speak on behalf of Whitaker Biotech or the Whitaker Foundation. Cassandra stared at the paper as if it were written in a language she refused to learn. Then she looked at the board, searching for a face that would rescue her, a friend who would say, "This is too far," a loyal ally who would object. But loyalty was a luxury, and Cassandra had spent years teaching them a different religion. Self-preservation. One board member finally spoke, voice tight. "Cassandra, we need to cooperate." Cooperate. The word hit Cassandra like humiliation. Imani felt something cold settle into place. Not satisfaction, not cruelty. Something cleaner. Accountability. And then the final step arrived, not as a threat, but as an interruption. The conference room door opened. 2 investigators entered, badges visible but not flashed theatrically. Calm faces. No urgency, because they had already won the moment they walked in. Behind them, a third person carried a sealed box in a clipboard. "Good afternoon," the lead investigator said. "We're here regarding an ongoing inquiry into financial misconduct, obstruction of compliance reporting, and false statements connected to Whitaker Biotech." The room went still. Cassandra's breath caught, just once. The investigator glanced down at his paperwork, then looked up. "Cassandra Whitaker," he said, "we need you to come with us." Cassandra's pearls shone violently against her throat, as if trying to remind the world she was still someone. She stood, slowly. "This is a mistake," she said, voice controlled, almost polite. The investigator's expression didn't change. "You can explain that later." Cassandra turned toward the door, still believing she could walk out with dignity intact. But the security guard outside stepped forward and blocked her path. Not roughly, firmly, as if the building itself had finally learned to say no. Imani watched Cassandra's eyes move, quickly, searching for leverage, for a script, for a camera to charm. There was none. No applause. No dramatic music, just the clean sound of consequence arriving on schedule. Cassandra looked back at Imani one last time, her voice low and trembling with something she hadn't felt in years. "This isn't who you are," Cassandra whispered, as if naming Imani could control her. Imani's voice stayed soft. "No," she said, "this is who you made me become." And as Cassandra was escorted out, pearls still shining, power already gone, Imani felt the room shift again, not toward cruelty, toward truth. Because downfall, when it's earned, doesn't need a spectacle. It only needs the right access, revoked in real time. 3 weeks later, Seattle looked like it had forgiven the storm. The city was bright again, blue water, pale sun, glass towers catching light like they'd invented it. News cycles moved on, as they always did, searching for fresher outrage. But inside Whitaker Biotech, something had changed that couldn't be scrolled past. Silence had been replaced with structure. Imani walked through the lobby without flinching now. The screen still played Gabe Whitaker's highlight reel, but the difference was subtle and profound. No one used his name as a shield anymore. People spoke carefully, not out of fear of Cassandra, but out of respect for the record. Ethan met her by the elevators, a folder under his arm, eyes steady in the way they'd always been, numbers first, ego last. "The audit's clean where it should be," he said, "and ugly where it has to be." Imani nodded. "Ugly is honest." He watched her for a beat. "The board wants a press conference. They want you to reassure the market." Imani let out a quiet breath. Not tired, not bitter, just aware. "Reassure," she repeated, "like truth is a product." Ethan's mouth tightened, the closest he came to a smile. Exactly. They rode the elevator in silence. When the doors opened, they didn't step into the boardroom first. They stepped into a smaller conference space, plain, glass-walled, filled with daylight and paper. On the table sat a stack of new policies: whistleblower protections, compliance independence, conflict of interest disclosures, third-party oversight. Not glamorous, not cinematic, but real. Richard Reardon was already there, reading through the final draft with the satisfaction of a man who'd spent decades watching power avoid accountability. "You kept your promise," he said to Imani. Imani didn't ask which promise. She knew. The promise to make this about reality, not revenge. Across the glass wall, employees moved through the hallways like people learning they could breathe. No frantic whispers, no sudden loyalty performances, just work, honest work, untangled from fear. Imani slid into a chair, not at the head of the table, but beside it. She didn't need a throne to prove she had authority. She had something stronger than a title: direction. She signed the final page with a clean stroke. Then she set the pen down gently, as if the act itself deserved respect. "This is the part they don't understand," Imani said softly, more to herself than anyone else. "I didn't come here to belong." Richard looked up. Ethan's gaze stayed on her. Imani lifted her eyes to them. "Belonging is permission," she said, "and permission can be revoked." She placed her palm flat on the documents, anchoring them. "I came here to set rules," she continued. "Rules that don't depend on who likes me. Rules that protect people who don't have pearls or power or a room full of witnesses." Ethan nodded once, as if he'd been waiting to hear her name it plainly. Later, the press conference happened, but not the way the board imagined. No dramatic entrance, no revenge speech, no glossy performance. Imani stood at the podium in a simple black suit, hair pulled back, face calm. She didn't beg for trust. She didn't ask for sympathy. She didn't mention Cassandra. She spoke about audits, oversight, patient safety, truth with paperwork behind it. And when a reporter tried to drag her back into scandal, "Were you involved with Dr. Whitaker?" Imani answered with the same quiet precision she used in the ER. "My personal life is not a courtroom exhibit," she said. "The record is what matters." Then she stepped away, not fleeing, ending it. That night, Imani returned to the one place that had never asked her to perform: the hospital. Harborview's fluorescent lights buzzed softly. Nurses moved with the rhythm of people who did hard things without applause. A patient's monitor beeped in a steady cadence, like a reminder that life was always urgent somewhere. In the staff bathroom, Imani washed her hands and looked at herself in the mirror. No pearls, no spotlight, no myth. Just a woman who had survived being dismissed and decided that dismissal would never again be the final word. Her hand drifted to her stomach. Brief, protective, certain. "Not their story," she whispered. When she walked back into the hallway, her phone buzzed. A message from Nia. "Proud of you. You didn't just win, you changed the rules." Imani stared at the words for a moment, then slipped the phone away and kept walking, steady, unshaken, present. Because power, real power, didn't look like revenge. It looked like a woman who no longer asked to be let in, because she'd built a door no one could lock. And if this story moved you, if you felt that shift, that quiet kind of justice, take a second to comment what moment hit you the hardest, and follow the channel. We're telling stories where truth isn't loud, but it always wins.